The Pacific was burning. Washington had a plan: bypass the Philippines, strike Taiwan, and move closer to Japan. But one man refused. General Douglas MacArthur defied his superiors, risked his career, and gambled with thousands of lives to keep a promise: "I shall return." What followed was the deadliest beachhead of the Pacific War, and the moment that changed history forever. MacArthur versus Washington. The clash of strategy. By 1944, the Pacific War had entered its most decisive phase. After years of brutal fighting across jungle islands and coral atolls, the United States had pushed Japanese forces back from the outer perimeter of their empire. Victories in the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, the Gilbert and Marshall Chains, and most recently the Marianas, had put American forces within striking distance of Japan itself. But the question of where to strike next exposed a deep rift between Washington and its most controversial commander in the Pacific, General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur had returned to the Philippines in 1942 with his famous vow, "I shall return," after being ordered by President Roosevelt to evacuate from Corregidor. For him, the liberation of the Philippines was not just a strategic priority, it was a personal mission. He believed that failing to retake the islands would be a betrayal of America's promise to the Filipino people and a stain on his own honor. To his soldiers, many of whom had fought and suffered through the humiliations of Bataan and Corregidor, the Philippines represented unfinished business. But in Washington and at Pearl Harbor, the strategic picture looked different. Admiral Chester Nimitz and the Navy High Command preferred a thrust northward toward Taiwan and Okinawa, bypassing the Philippines entirely. Taiwan would provide a direct springboard to the Chinese mainland and shorten the path to Japan. Washington planners argued that bypassing the Philippines would save lives and accelerate Japan's defeat. To them, MacArthur's obsession with returning to Manila seemed more emotional than rational. The debate grew heated throughout mid-1944. In conferences with President Roosevelt and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, MacArthur argued passionately and defiantly. He insisted that abandoning the Philippines would devastate American credibility in Asia. How could the United States present itself as a liberator if it left millions of Filipinos under Japanese rule? Moreover, he pointed out that the archipelago sat astride Japan's vital sea lanes, connecting the resource-rich territories of the Dutch East Indies with the Japanese homeland. Retaking the Philippines would choke off Japan's supplies of oil, rubber, and raw materials. His language was rarely diplomatic. MacArthur clashed openly with the Navy, dismissing their preferred plans as strategically unsound and accusing them of ignoring the moral dimension of the war. Washington officials, in turn, accused MacArthur of insubordination, of allowing his ego and promise to the Filipinos to override larger Allied strategy. President Roosevelt found himself caught between his admirals and his general. But MacArthur was relentless. In meetings, he hammered the table, demanded recognition of the Philippines' strategic importance, and invoked America's honor. In September 1944, at a crucial conference in Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt asked both MacArthur and Nimitz to present their cases. Nimitz calmly outlined the advantages of a Taiwan offensive, backed by naval logistics and fleet readiness. MacArthur, in contrast, delivered a fiery speech that left no doubt of his intentions. He argued that the Philippines were not just a military objective but a test of America's soul. If the United States abandoned them, he declared, "Our words to a people who have stood by us will be but empty promises, and our honor will be gone." In the end, Roosevelt sided with MacArthur. The general had ignored Washington's hesitation, defied the Navy's calculations, and won the argument through sheer force of will. Orders were drafted for an invasion of Leyte in the central Philippines. To Washington, the decision carried grave risks. The Japanese were expected to fight ferociously, and the terrain of Leyte offered few advantages for the attackers. But to MacArthur, it was vindication. He had forced the issue, overruled his critics, and secured the chance to fulfill his vow. As the convoys assembled in the Pacific, MacArthur's men prepared for what was to come. They knew the landings would be bloody. Japanese forces had fortified the beaches and inland defenses, and their fleet was still capable of challenging the U.S. Navy in a decisive battle. Yet morale surged. For the soldiers who had endured Bataan, for the sailors who had seen the tide of war turn, and for the Filipino people still under occupation, the promise was finally becoming reality. MacArthur had defied Washington, And now he would have to deliver. The landing at Leyte, Pacific's deadliest beachhead. On the morning of October 20th, 1944, the calm waters of Leyte Gulf erupted into history's largest amphibious operation in the Pacific to that point. Over 700 ships of the U.S. 7th Fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral Thomas Kincaid, converged on the beaches of Leyte Island. Inside those ships were more than 130,000 American soldiers and Marines, joined by thousands of Filipino guerrillas awaiting their return. General Douglas MacArthur, standing tall on the bridge of the flagship USS Nashville, looked toward the coast. This was the moment he had fought Washington for, the return to the Philippines. The plan called for landings along Leyte's eastern coast, at the towns of Tacloban and Dulag. U.S. troops would storm ashore, secure the beachhead, and then push inland to seize the island's airfields. Japanese forces, numbering around 20,000 initially, had fortified the hills and swamps, laying mines and digging machine gun nests. They were under the command of General Tomoyuki Yamashita, one of Japan's most formidable field commanders. Reinforcements from Luzon and Mindanao were expected to arrive quickly, making speed essential. As the first waves of landing craft approached, the beaches erupted with fire. Japanese artillery zeroed in, shells exploding among the incoming boats. Kamikaze planes made their first organized attacks of the war, diving into American ships with devastating force. Yet the assault pressed forward. Soldiers of the U.S. 6th Army, under General Walter Kruger, leapt into the surf, wading through chest-deep water under machine gun fire. Many never made it across. Others crawled through the sand, clawing forward inch by inch. The beaches of Leyte became littered with bodies, friend and foe alike. The fighting was merciless. Japanese defenders, dug into pillboxes and caves, fought to the last man. Every coconut grove and swamp became a killing ground. Flamethrowers and grenades were used to clear bunkers, while tanks bogged down in the mud and marshes. Casualty rates in the first 48 hours were staggering. It was a reminder that Leyte would not be another Saipan or Guam. It would be bloodier, harder, and longer. Amid the chaos, MacArthur made his dramatic return. That afternoon, he waded ashore near Red Beach at Palo, accompanied by Philippine President Sergio Osmeña and other officials. Cameras captured the moment as he declared into waiting microphones, "People of the Philippines, I have returned. By the grace of Almighty God, our forces stand again on Philippine soil." For Filipinos listening to clandestine radios across the islands, the words carried hope. For his critics in Washington, it was proof that MacArthur's gamble had become a global spectacle. But behind the symbolic moment lay grim reality. The Japanese were not giving up Leyte easily. Reinforcements poured in through Ormoc Bay, bringing in tanks, artillery, and thousands of fresh troops. The terrain of the island, thick jungle, endless rain, and impassable swamps, slowed the American advance. Disease became as deadly as bullets. Malaria and dysentery ravaged the ranks. Guerrilla fighters joined the struggle, ambushing Japanese convoys and guiding American patrols. But progress remained painfully slow. The fight for the beachhead stretched into weeks. Dulag fell, then Tacloban, but each mile inland was contested. Japanese counterattacks at night sent waves of infantry charging with bayonets, supported by artillery barrages. Entire units were cut off and surrounded in the interior hills. For the Americans, holding the beachhead meant constant resupply under fire, as Japanese aircraft targeted transport ships and convoys. It was here that kamikazes proved most deadly, sinking or crippling dozens of vessels and adding a terrifying new dimension to the war. By early November, the scale of the battle had become clear. Leyte was no quick strike. It was a grinding, attritional campaign. Over 70,000 Japanese troops were eventually committed to the island. American and Filipino forces fought them village by village, ridge by ridge, until resistance finally began to crumble. Yet the cost was enormous. Tens of thousands of dead and wounded on both sides. The beaches of Leyte, where the first waves had landed, were transformed into vast cemeteries of wrecked vehicles, burned-out landing craft, and hastily dug graves. Washington had doubted the wisdom of this invasion, fearing it would bleed the U.S. dry. And indeed, the landing at Leyte was the Pacific's deadliest beachhead. But despite the carnage, The Americans had secured a foothold in the heart of the Philippines. MacArthur's gamble was paying off. Now, the question was whether they could hold it against the full fury of the Japanese Navy, which was assembling for one last desperate battle. The Battle of Leyte Gulf. Ignoring orders, seizing victory. The landings at Leyte had shocked Tokyo. For months, Japanese high command had debated where the Americans would strike next. Taiwan, Okinawa, or even the Japanese home islands. Few believed MacArthur would dare such a direct assault into the central Philippines. Now, with U.S. troops ashore and pushing inland, the Imperial Japanese Navy prepared to stake everything on a desperate counterattack. The result would be the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in history, and the last real hope for Japan to turn the tide. The Japanese plan, Operation Shogo, was complex and audacious. A massive decoy force of carriers, stripped of most of their aircraft, would lure Admiral William Halsey's powerful Third Fleet away from Leyte Gulf. Meanwhile, two separate Japanese surface fleets would converge from the north and south, striking the vulnerable American transport and landing ships supporting MacArthur's men on the beaches. If successful, they could annihilate the beachhead, stranding the U.S. Sixth Army and perhaps even reversing the invasion. Washington's planners had long feared such a move. They had urged caution, arguing that bypassing the Philippines would avoid this kind of decisive naval showdown. But MacArthur had pressed forward regardless. And now the gamble had arrived at its critical moment. From October 23 to 26, 1944, the waters surrounding Leyte became a cauldron of fire. Off Samar, in one of the most dramatic episodes of the war, a small U.S. escort carrier group known as Taffy 3 found itself facing the overwhelming might of the Japanese center force, including battleships and heavy cruisers. Outgunned and outnumbered, the Americans fought with desperate courage. Destroyers charged headlong at battleships, launching torpedoes at suicidal range. Pilots took off from tiny carriers with whatever bombs or depth charges they had, diving again and again into the enemy formation. The ferocity of the defense convinced Admiral Kurita to withdraw, a decision that stunned his officers but saved the American invasion fleet from destruction. Meanwhile, to the north, Admiral Halsey had indeed taken the bait of the Japanese carrier decoy. His powerful Third Fleet raced after the empty carriers, leaving the San Bernardino Strait unguarded. Critics later argued that this move nearly doomed the Leyte operation. MacArthur himself fumed at what he saw as unnecessary risk. Yet in the chaos, luck favored the Americans. The Japanese northern force was destroyed, and though the southern force briefly broke through, it too was shattered by overwhelming American firepower. By the battle's end, Japan had lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The Imperial Navy, once the terror of the Pacific, had been broken beyond repair. For the soldiers on Leyte's beaches, the naval victory was invisible but decisive. Japanese reinforcements that might have turned the tide never arrived. Supply lines were cut, troop convoys annihilated. The U.S. beachhead, though battered and blood-soaked, was secure. The gamble of defying Washington had not only succeeded but had delivered one of the most decisive blows of the entire war. Yet even amid triumph, MacArthur remained contentious. Washington resented his constant criticisms of naval command, his grandstanding, and his refusal to admit error. Admirals blamed him for pushing them into one of the most dangerous gambits of the war. But to his men and to the Filipino people, none of that mattered. The Japanese fleet was wrecked, Leyte was on the path to liberation, and MacArthur's vow was being fulfilled step by step. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was not merely a tactical victory. It was the end of Japanese naval power. From that point on, Japan would fight on land and in the skies, but its fleet could no longer contest America's advance. For MacArthur, it was vindication, proof that ignoring Washington's doubts and forcing the issue had brought the Allies closer to final victory. But the battle for Leyte itself was far from over. The island's mountains and swamps still teemed with Japanese defenders, and the campaign would drag on for months. The blood price of MacArthur's decision had only begun to be paid. Consequences and legacy. MacArthur's gamble and the liberation of the Philippines. The guns of Leyte Gulf fell silent, but the island itself remained a battlefield for months. From October 1944 until late December, American and Filipino troops fought to clear the ridges, swamps, and towns of determined Japanese defenders. Reinforcements from Luzon trickled in, slipping through despite the destruction of Japan's main fleet. In total, more than 70,000 Japanese soldiers were committed to the defense of Leyte. Few would survive. The campaign was as much a struggle against nature as against the enemy. Torrential rains turned roads into quagmires, immobilizing tanks and supply trucks. Soldiers waded through waist-deep mud, battling leeches, mosquitoes, and disease. Dysentery, malaria, and trench foot struck thousands. In the skies, Japanese kamikazes intensified their attacks, slamming into transports and warships with terrifying effect. For the first time in the war, American sailors realized they were facing an enemy willing to use their very lives as weapons. Despite the ferocity of the defense, the outcome was never in doubt. American air power dominated the skies, and Filipino guerrillas harassed Japanese supply lines in the interior. Slowly, village by village, hill by hill, the U.S. Sixth Army and its allies pushed the enemy back. Tacloban was declared liberated and became the provisional capital of the Philippines. By Christmas 1944, organized Japanese resistance on Leyte had collapsed, though scattered fighting continued into early 1945. The cost was staggering. More than 15,000 American casualties, tens of thousands of Filipinos dead or wounded, and an estimated 70,000 Japanese soldiers killed. The beaches and fields of Leyte became scarred with wreckage. Burned-out landing craft, shattered tanks, mass graves. It was, as Washington had feared, the Pacific's deadliest beachhead. And yet, it was also the turning point that ensured Japan's eventual defeat. Strategically, the victory at Leyte severed Japan's vital supply lines from Southeast Asia. No longer could oil from the Dutch East Indies or resources from Malaya flow freely to the home islands. Japan's industrial war machine began to starve. The destruction of the Imperial Navy at Leyte Gulf meant the seas of the Pacific were now America's domain. From Leyte, the Allies would move on to Luzon, to Manila, to Okinawa, and finally toward Japan itself. For Douglas MacArthur, the consequences were deeply personal. He had defied Washington, dismissed the Navy's preferred strategy, and forced through his plan to return to the Philippines. Many had called it reckless, driven by ego and pride. But the results were undeniable. The Philippines were on the path to liberation, and Japan's empire had been fatally weakened. When he waded ashore at Palo and declared, "I have returned," it was more than a photo opportunity. It was the beginning of the end for Japan in the Pacific. Yet controversy never left him. Admirals and generals continued to resent his independence, his tendency to grandstand, and his disregard for orders. In Washington, some argued that his gamble had cost too many lives, that a direct thrust toward Taiwan might have shortened the war. But to the Filipino people, to the soldiers who had fought under his command, and to history itself, MacArthur's choice defined the liberation of an entire nation. By the time the war ended in August 1945, MacArthur stood in Tokyo Bay aboard the USS Missouri, accepting Japan's formal surrender. The man who had once been criticized for ignoring Washington's orders now presided over the end of the war in the Pacific. The legacy of Leyte is both tragic and triumphant. It was the deadliest beachhead of the Pacific War, a place where thousands gave their lives in mud and surf. But it was also the moment when America's return to the Philippines became unstoppable, when Japanese naval power was broken, and when the course of the war shifted irreversibly toward Allied victory. MacArthur's superiors may have doubted him, but his defiance gave the United States control of the Pacific's future. He had ignored Washington's orders, and in doing so, he had won not just a beachhead, but the path to final victory.